What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danelle Hallan, and I am back with another true crime video. And today's case is one that really threw me for a loop because I am a firm believer in Occam's razor, which basically means the most logical and obvious solution is the right one. And I think with true crime, that is one of the most commonly used beliefs because if there's all this evidence, it can only mean one thing, right? This is one of those cases that shakes that belief out because it shows that coincidences definitely still exist. And so I thought that was something that was important to bring to you guys today. Not only that, but this case also resulted in legislative changes and brought up a bunch of issues that I talk about all the time on my channel when it comes to Indigenous and Native people. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get into the case. It was a Saturday night in August of 2003 when 19-year-old Sonya Ivanoff walked off into the rain after spending the evening with her friends. But unfortunately, Sonya never made it home. And within days, the people of Nome, Alaska were searching the back roads and the shorelines for her, hoping for answers that ultimately they would never be ready to hear. When Sonya was ultimately found, everything that the community believed about safety and trust and justice was shattered. And what came next ended up changing Alaska law forever. Now, if you asked anyone who knew Sonya Ivanoff what she was like, the answer usually started the same way, that she was an incredibly dependable, life-loving, fun-loving young woman. She was one of those people that you could count on to show up, to follow through, and she deeply cared about the people around her. So Sonya Dora Ivanoff was born on April 13th, 1984 in Alaska, which is a really small coastal village along the Bering Sea. And it was the kind of place where family and school and community all blend together. The population is mostly Alaskan natives, and she grew up in a really big family. She was the fourth of 6 children, and she was raised by amazing parents that taught her the value of hard work and kindness. And those that knew her said that she carried those lessons from her parents everywhere she went. When she was in school, Sonya was an honor roll student. She was also a standout basketball player. She was tall at 5'11". She was really, really good at playing basketball. Her coaches also said she was respectful and focused. She was always upbeat and laughing, encouraging others, so she really made hard practices a little easier and kept everyone's spirits up, even if they lost a game or maybe had a really tough practice. And if you've ever played sports, you know how important people like that on the team end up being. Now, eventually, Sonya went on to graduate from high school in 2002, and she was really ready to take her next step. And so she and her best friend, Timmery, made plans to move to Nome. Now, if you're familiar with Alaska at all, you probably are familiar with Nome. It's larger, there's more opportunities than a lot of the outlying villages, and the two of them really wanted a chance to experience a little bit more of the world, but they wanted to stay at least close to home. And so their plan was simple. Nome was where they were going to go. They were going to work and save money, and eventually they were going to move away from there and go to college. Now, Nome sits along Alaska's western coast. It's a really small town still with just a few thousand people. But I say small very loosely because in Alaska, and especially coming from a town like Unalakleet, Nome felt huge. Life was faster, but it was still a steady pace. There were lots of places to go out, lots of things to do, and it was still small enough where everyone seemed to know one another. And for a lot of people that grew up in nearby smaller villages, like Sonya, Nome was kind of this natural next step if they wanted to move away, a place for new beginnings. But unfortunately, also kind of bubbling underneath the surface, Nome wasn't perfect. Over the years, some Alaskan Native residents had quietly spoken out about a lot of mistrust toward local authorities. And this is a common theme in Alaska. You have these really small towns that are mainly filled with Alaskan Native residents, and a lot of the times, the police department is predominantly white, and so there can be a lot of issues. And so a lot of these Alaskan natives in Nome felt that reports of harassment that they dealt with, or violence, or pretty much any of their issues were never taken seriously by law enforcement. And so it wasn't something that I think people openly talked about all of the time, but it was definitely there. Being 19 years old, first time really heading out into the world, those divisions and issues weren't really what she saw when she first arrived to Nome. For her, Nome represented independence. It was a chance to build a future all on her own. She and Timmery were focused on their work, their plans. They were also enjoying this new little bit of freedom that they had in a place that still felt familiar. And Sonya specifically had huge dreams to end up somewhere warmer. This was like a stepping stone in her long plans for the future that she hoped would land her in Hawaii. Now, once in Nome, Sonya found a job at Norton Sound Regional Hospital, and she worked at the admitting desk, and she typically was on night shifts, so she would greet patients as they came in, and everyone remembered her as being calm and kind, someone that made you feel at ease, even on a stressful day, which typically, if you're going to end up at the hospital, it's probably been a stressful day, and so she was awesome at her job. She fit in beautifully. She and Timmery also shared a small apartment in Nome, and they walked everywhere together. Neither of them had a car, and they really didn't need one. Again, Nome was small. They had made plenty of friends all over the place. There were lots of homes they could stop at and take a rest, and they truly believed that they were safe. This was a lifestyle they were used to living in Alaska, just at a little bit of a bigger scale. Sonya talked to her family often. She was really close with her parents and stayed connected with all of her siblings. And I believe her sister and brother-in-law actually lived in Nome, not too far from her. Her family said that she was responsible. She was the one they never really had to worry about. So they were excited for her when she headed off to Nome. But even then, her family did make sure that she was doing everything in her power to take care of herself. Specifically, her sister and brother-in-law that lived nearby would consistently remind her to be careful. I think they probably knew about some of the issues that happened in Nome, and they really just wanted to make sure she protected herself because Sonya would go out with friends. She would go to local bars. They knew that behind the fun atmosphere was a town with a rough history for natives. But Sonya, being outspoken and almost 6 feet tall, athletic, and a force to be reckoned with, it really felt like more of a precaution than something they would actually ever have to worry about. And Sonya seemed really receptive of all of these concerns and warnings to be careful. And by the summer of 2003, her life was going great. She had built this simple, happy routine in a place that felt like home. But in August of that year, everything changed. August 10th, 2003 was a quiet Sunday night in Nome, and Sonya spent the evening with a handful of her friends. They were playing games and relaxing after a long week of work and preparing for the week ahead of them. Her best friend and roommate, Timmery, was with her that night, and the two of them had a great time. They laughed, they joked, they made plans for the week ahead, and as the evening came to an end, the group started to break up. And at this point, it was late. It was sometime after 1 a.m. Being in Alaska during the summer, I think that the sun set sometime between 11 and midnight. So the sun had literally just gone down and a light rain had started to fall. And so Timmery and Sonya were trying to figure out their plans. And Timmery decided to stay the night at a friend's house nearby because she had to work really early the next morning. And she really wanted to spend that extra time sleeping as opposed to having to walk home. And Sonya, on the other hand, decided that she would go ahead and head back to their apartment on her own. Now, their apartment wasn't too far. It was a decent walk, but it was nothing that she wasn't used to. Sonya also really loved the rain, and that night it was like that misty kind of rain, which was her absolute favorite. So she was pretty set on heading home on her own. And before they parted ways, the two friends said goodbye like they always did, very playfully with their typical phrase, "Peace out, pal," and a wave. Timmery watched as Sonya walked down the street towards their home, jumping in the rain with a smile on her face, having no idea that that was going to be the last time anyone that loved her would see her alive. Now, Timmery went on to stay at a friend's house, and the next morning, Monday, August 11th, she stopped by their apartment at around 5 a.m. before heading to work. She had to get ready, take a quick shower, clothes, makeup, the whole 9 yards. And when she got there, she immediately thought it was strange because Sonya wasn't at the apartment. And it was clear that her bed also hadn't even been slept in. And I think the two of them shared a room, shared a bed. It was a really small apartment. So it would have been obvious and known to Timmery if Sonya had been there the night before. And so this was really the first sign that something wasn't right. But Timmery was trying to reason with herself like most people do. Maybe Sonya had, along her walk, decided she was tired. She just wanted to crash at a nearby friend's house instead of making the whole walk home. Or maybe, for whatever reason, she had just woken up and gone out earlier than expected, and she was just overthinking this bed situation. But that wasn't really making sense because Sonya didn't have work that Monday. She didn't have work until Tuesday, actually. So it was more likely that she would have slept in and enjoyed a later morning, especially after being out so late the night before. So despite these possibly logical explanations that she was trying to tell herself, Timmery could not shake the gut feeling that something was very wrong. Now, she went on to work that day, and throughout the day, she kept on waiting for a call from Sonya. There weren't cell phones at this time, but Sonya still would typically find a way to reach out to her and talk to her. They were best friends. They spent majority of their time together that they weren't working. And so after a couple of hours passed and concerned, given the fact it didn't seem Sonya had come home, Timmery decided to reach out to Sonya's sister and brother-in-law. Maybe she went over there for whatever reason, and she was kind of hoping that's what they would say. But they also hadn't seen or spoken to Sonya. And they also didn't really want to panic at first. They personally, and I think quietly without saying anything to Timmery, felt that maybe there had just been a rift between the friends. Maybe Sonya was purposefully just trying to get some space from Timmery. They didn't think too much about it. And so they were like, you know what? She's got work the following day. So she likely is going to show up to work and we'll all feel silly because everything will be fine. But despite hearing this from Sonya's family, Timmery remained really worried. Now, that evening when Timmery got home from work, it was obvious that Sonya still hadn't come back. Every single thing remained as it had that morning when she got there. And despite Sonya being the kind of person that always had to have her hair and makeup done, her makeup bag sat there untouched. Like, even if she had stayed the night at somebody's house and just hadn't had a chance to call, before she went anywhere else, she would have come home to get herself together first. This was a routine thing for Sonya. And so at this point, Timmery's concern was turning to panic. It was not at all like Sonya to just disappear or to leave without telling anyone where she was going, especially not her best friend and roommate. And at that point, if she hadn't said anything to Timmery, she would have gone straight to her sister. And since her sister hadn't heard from her, Timmery was really scared about Sonya's whereabouts. So the following day, Tuesday, August 12, 2003, Timmery woke up and Sonya still wasn't there. And so she headed into work, but she still could not shake that worried feeling. And so she figured maybe Sonya got arrested. Something happened and she got in trouble. And so she called into Nome Police Department to see if that's what happened. But there was nobody in jail under Sonya's name. So by 5 p.m. that night, nearly 41 hours after Sonya was last seen, Timmery went straight to the Nome Police Department after work to report her best friend as missing. And around the same time that Timmery was at the police station, Sonya's sister and brother-in-law were being told that Sonya had failed to show up for her hospital shift that day. Her coworkers said that this was out of character for her, not to appear and not to call in at least. And so that paired with her failing to come home and last being seen walking off into the darkness and rain, no one had a good feeling about whatever happened to Sonya. But when Timmery went to the police to tell them all of this information, they did not seem nearly as concerned. When Timmery filed the report, she remembered being upset and she was crying hysterically. She knew in her gut something was not right, and she was trying to make officers understand that Sonya would not just walk off and disappear. But she says that none of her concerns were taken seriously. Officers instead just told her that Sonya was probably fine. Again, maybe staying with friends, or like Sonya's sister and brother-in-law thought, maybe needing space after a disagreement. But Timmery just kept saying there's been no disagreement. Like, there's no reason for Sonya to leave. If she was with a friend, someone would know about it, but no one had seen her. And so police did take the report and they had Timmery write down a list of Sonya's friends, but not much action was taken aside from that. By the time Sonya was officially reported as missing, the search for her had already begun, but not by law enforcement. All of Sonya's friends and coworkers, members of her family, continued searching the area around Nome. They were checking the paths that she might have taken home that night. People were looking along the roads. They were going in alleys, anywhere that Sonya may have gone. And flyers were also made. Sonya's description was shared with the police and everyone nearby. Her photo was passed around. She had last been seen wearing Skechers sneakers, a denim jacket, and jeans. And her wallet and identification were with her, as they always were when she went out. But still, there was little visible response from local authorities, and much of that early searching was done by those who knew and loved her. At this point, Sonia's sister and brother-in-law also decided to go to the police station because at this point, they're like, we think we have an idea of someone she may possibly be with, and they wanted to try to get information about this person to go and talk to them, or at the very least, give this information to police so they could talk to them. And this person was a man named Kunuk. Now, Kunuk apparently had been very romantically interested in Sonya, and they were good friends, but he was just not her cup of tea, okay? He was not her type. So she ended up ultimately pushing that aside and wanted to just remain friends with him. He lived in a camper somewhere on a piece of land in Nome. They were telling police all about this and trying to get information on his camp. But just like with Timmery, the police seemed less than interested with all of this information that Sonya's family was bringing to them. And so it wasn't until Sonya failed to show up for a second shift and her employer reported her as missing as well that police finally seemed to take interest in the case. So now we're talking Wednesday, August 13th. At this point is the first time that authorities really did anything about Sonya's disappearance. An officer ended up going to speak with Timmery about Sonya. They wanted to know about her mental health, if she had any recent struggles, just like the typical questions that are asked. But Timmery said that she had been great. She was thriving. Timmery didn't know of any reason, as she'd already told him several times, that Sonya would run off. There were no enemies that she knew of that would want to harm her. And so Nome police at this point decided to reach out to the fire department to head out on a group search. And it didn't take but a few hours for something to be found. That same afternoon into the nighttime, a volunteer firefighter driving along a gravel road on the outskirts of Nome noticed something out of place. And it was near an area that locals called the Nome Gravel Pit. And I think the road this man was on was specifically called Dredge Road 5. This is a big mining community, so there was a lot of trucking and things back and forth and, gold mining and all of that. And so this was kind of the area that they were in. And so when he stopped to check on this strange thing that he saw, he ended up discovering a body that was partially hidden in the brush. Nome police were called out right away, and they knew the moment they saw this person that this had to be Sonya. And immediately upon checking out the scene and her body, they knew this was going to be way out of their league. They seriously were going to need outside help. So they ended up calling in the ABI, or the Alaska Bureau of Investigations. Local officers at this point secured the entire area, and it was like no joke. They covered the whole scene with tarps. I'm talking the trees, the bushes, the road, the body. I mean, just anywhere they thought might be evidence, they covered it with plastic. They were worried that the wind might blow away surrounding dirt that holds evidence. They also were taking turns working the perimeter of the site, armed in case a curious grizzly bear showed up. This was the tundra of Alaska, so not only was it already a challenging place for a crime to occur, but they had to protect this area and preserve as much evidence as possible until the ABI could get there. And I feel like you're probably hearing this and you're like, why on earth would they need to take shifts and cover everything? ABI should be able to get there relatively quickly, but we're talking about Alaska. And it's not as easy as it is in other places for outside agencies to casually pop in. The headquarters for the ABI was 500 miles away in Anchorage, and I don't even think there's any direct road or easy way that wouldn't take hours and hours for them to drive there. And so all of the people that were coming in to take over and look into this case had to fly in. It was not an easy task to get from Anchorage to Nome. It took quite some time. It's not like there's flights every hour on the dot. Nome police had to do all that they could to ensure that they kept the scene safe until then. Now, when ABI did arrive, they began to process the scene. Sonya's remains were roughly 2 miles outside of Nome, and she was naked except for a single sock on her left foot, and she was found lying face down in the brush. It was determined that she had been shot once in the back of the head at close range with a .22 caliber firearm. Sonya Ivanoff had been murdered and dumped out in the tundra of Alaska. Now, investigators immediately noticed so many strange things about the scene because there was little to no physical evidence left behind. other than Sonya herself. Her clothing and her personal belongings had been taken from the scene. I mean, they looked as far as they could to see if they had been dumped nearby, but there was no sign of them. There were also no shell casings, no fibers, no sign of a struggle, almost nothing at all to work with. An examination of her body showed that there wasn't even any sign of someone else's DNA. There was nothing under her nails, despite the fact that she had been undressed, very likely not by herself. There was still no DNA anywhere on her body. So it was immediately clear that whoever committed this crime knew exactly what they were doing. The precision of the scene, the absence of evidence, and the deliberate removal of things that could tie back to a perpetrator suggested someone who understood forensic procedure. And so that realization obviously left investigators uneasy from the very beginning. And I'm sure you can assume why. As word spread through Nome, the entire community understandably was shaken. People had spent the last 2 days searching for her and now were confronted with the unthinkable. Fear and grief were rippling through this town, and for Sonya's family, hope was now replaced by heartbreak. In the hours and days that followed, investigators continued to process the scene, and they started to interview anyone who had seen or spoken with Sonya before her disappearance. And they weren't even sure at this point, because they couldn't find any casings, if that actually was where the murder occurred. Maybe Sonya had been killed elsewhere and dumped at this location. Now, the only bits of evidence that they found at the scene ended up being tire impressions. There had been a pool of blood near Sonya's body, and a car at some point after her death drove right through that pool of blood, possibly whoever was responsible. And so they photographed these tracks, and when they did that, they noticed that the tires were mismatched. And so they were really clinging to these little pieces of evidence. Hopefully this would make identifying the car that much easier. If someone had driven through those tracks, there would be traces of blood, if not on the tires, on the wheel well. Also, it should be easy to identify a car that has mismatched tires. So while it was a small thing, it was enough to at least get them some sort of direction. And the only other thing they discovered were small flecks of light blue paint on nearby brush and foliage surrounding the scene. And this also helped a ton, even though it seemed like such a small thing, because the placement was really high up on the branches. And so obviously, being blue in color, they knew that the car likely was blue, but also because of the placement, it had to be a truck or an SUV. And so they were looking for a blue truck or SUV with mismatched tires that likely had blood on the tire or the wheel well. And at least that was somewhere to start. Crews continued to search the surrounding brush for the missing casings or any identification of who was behind the crime. They were collecting soil, debris. Now, with the crime scene processed and community tension rising, Nome police pressed forward, desperate for any answers. And one place they felt they could confidently start out with during the investigation was looking into that list of friends that Timmery had provided when she first reported Sonya as missing. And there was one person that stuck out. Not only had Sonya's sister and brother-in-law already expressed interest in talking to him, spoke about his possible involvement, Kunuk had a blue Chevy pickup, and his history was far from ideal. Authorities were already very familiar with him, unfortunately, because Kunuk had a violent history involving the mother of his child. He had several domestic violence charges, he was known for being a hothead, and it was also known that he had a thing for Sonya and she had denied him. And so a lot of people began to worry that maybe on her walk home, Kunuk just so happened to pass by her, offered her a ride, maybe he made more advances, and she freaked out, and it led to her death. And so authorities started looking deeper into Kunuk and noticed that not only did his car match the color of the paint chips found at the scene, but even further, he had mismatched tires on the truck. And it was exactly the same spot that the impressions had near the gravel pit. Like, you got 4 tires. What are the chances that the same tire that made a certain impression on a certain side matches this person's car along with the color? I mean, investigators saw this and they're like, we for sure have found our suspect. And that original thought that he might be involved only intensified. Kunuk's car and belongings were all covered in blood, you guys. There was blood under the car, on the tire, in the wheel well, like exactly like authorities knew there would be if whoever murdered Sonya had driven through that pile of blood to leave the scene. But that wasn't the only place there was blood. They also found blood on Kunuk's shoes. There was a tarp that was covered in blood. There was blood on the floorboard of his car. In the back of the truck, there were also 3 rifles, and one of the butts of those rifles was covered in blood. Authorities thought for sure that this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. They believed they had finally uncovered the person that was responsible for Sonya's murder. I mean, they had everything from blood to the mismatched tires, the same color of the car, the same caliber weapon in his car. They even had a possible motive that she had denied his advances. And so they brought Kunuk in for questioning, and it seemed to just further seal the deal. Kunuk ended up claiming to authorities that he hadn't seen Sonya in 2 weeks. Like, he very quickly said, whoa, like, I have nothing to do with this. And he even claimed to have an alibi for the night of her murder. Kunuk said that he was 70-some miles away hunting with a group of friends, and all of them would vouch for him. And while that does seem reasonable, when they started to confront him about all that blood evidence they were finding on his car, his story started to fall apart in authorities' eyes. Kunuk began to claim that he had randomly just so happened to hit a rabbit or possibly a porcupine. He wasn't sure while he was driving his truck one night. And so when he went to see what he had hit, he noticed that the animal he hit had not died on impact. And so he went to put it out of its misery. It was not going to heal from what happened to it. And so he killed this animal, which is how the blood got on his tires, on his wheel well, on his shoes, on the gun. But authorities are hearing this and they're like, you killed an animal and can't even remember what kind of animal it was. And like, as a hunter, you're probably going to know that. You can't just confuse a porcupine and a rabbit. And so all of this just felt so convenient and fabricated. And when they went to take photos of him, the suspicion grew even more. Investigators ended up noticing that he had fresh scratches on his back, and they asked him about it to see how he would swing this one. And he claimed that it was actually from the mother of his child. But at this point, they're like, all right, okay, we found so much evidence that could not possibly be coincidental tied to your car. You've got fresh scratches on you. You have blood literally everywhere. You claim you have an alibi, but they hadn't been able to confirm that with anyone else yet. And so they're like, we're going to take you to the hospital and have you fully examined for more injuries. They end up finding several scratch marks on him. They took his DNA, but he stuck to his story and his alibi. Now, I don't know if they ever ended up speaking to any of his friends, but I don't think they'd probably believe them anyways if they said they were with him that night, because there was so much other evidence pointing to him possibly being responsible. And so everything that was forensically examined was sent to the lab, and Nome PD fully believed that it was going to come back formally connecting Kunuk to Sonya's murder, and he would be arrested, and that would be that. Case closed. But when the lab results came back, that sense of victory quickly vanished. The blood turned out to be from an animal, exactly as Kunuk said that they thought was so ridiculous. Authorities were actually even able to go and locate the porcupine, because yes, it was a porcupine and not a rabbit that he hit. He was able to tell them exactly where he hit it, and lo and behold, they drive there. There that poor thing is on the side of the road. His tires, despite being the incredible same placement as the mismatched mark on the ground near Sonya's body, also did not match the tread from the scene. The mismatch was still there, but it was not the same tires. It was just pure coincidence that he and someone else had mismatched tires on the exact same spot in their car. Not only that, investigators ended up learning that the tire tracks actually weren't even related to the murder at all. They ended up belonging to a couple who had unknowingly driven that same road in the darkness, completely unaware that there was a body nearby. And then finally, no connection could be made at all between the blue paint and Kunuk's vehicle, and within days, the case collapsed back to uncertainty. All the blood could be accounted for. It was from that poor animal, from his hunting adventures. And I know you guys probably heard all of that, and you were like, there's no way he is not responsible for this. But it really was exactly how he said it was. And now they're back to square one. Now, within a week, the investigation into Sonya's death had gone from having 8 officers on the case to just 2. Like, that's how fast they were like, okay, well, it's a murder. Let's dive into it. And by dive into it, I mean completely cut the amount of people on the case, which is very, very frustrating. And even more so because those 2 officers that ended up being assigned to her case worked opposite shifts. So it wasn't even like they could work together on the case. And even more frustrating, Officer Redburn refused to give over any information at all to the night shift officer, who really couldn't even do anything on the night shift anyways, because what on earth is he supposed to do about this case where he has no case file or information to even read things at night. He certainly isn't going to go interview people or search around in the dark in the middle of the tundra. So it really just feels like this whole case was set up for failure. And like so many other cases that involve Alaskan natives, it felt like no one was actually investigating. No one was taking the time to figure out who did this awful thing to Sonya. Nobody cared. And so Sonya's sister and brother-in-law decided to go put her picture up at Nome Police Department so that everyone had to see her and they couldn't forget her. And they didn't want her to be swept under the rug and just ignored, to have her case quietly go cold and be put up on a shelf. And unfortunately, when they did this, one of the officers got so angry. He was literally all in their ear about how they needed to take the photo down, how they couldn't put that up there. It just made them feel even worse, and even more so that no one cared about Sonya. Now, around a month after Sonya's death, Nome police had run out of solid leads. The community's frustration was growing much louder, and confidence in the department was fading really fast. And then, just as the case seemed to be stalling completely, something happened that pushed the tension to Nome to a whole new level. The night shift officer, Officer Ivanoff, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, had grown tired of being ignored on a case that he was supposed to be investigating. I mean, it doesn't even seem that at this point anyone had given him a file. Like, he wasn't able to see anything about this murder case that he was supposed to be looking into every time he went in for a shift. So little was shared with him that he decided that's enough. He was going to step up and demand to have it, and he planned to essentially start the case from scratch. He's like, I have no clue what Officer Redburn is doing during the day, so I'm going to investigate this on my own, and hopefully I can come up with something. And so he started from the very first page of Sonya's file, reading through every single thing. And almost immediately, he hit one hand-scribbled note that stopped him in his tracks, because this note was like a blip in the case file. Like, it had been put in there and then ignored. And it was huge. It was a witness that claimed to see Sonya the night she disappeared. And it hadn't been followed up on. And what it was claiming was huge. So Officer Ivanoff went to meet with the woman who had called in this sighting. Now, this woman's name is Florence Habros. She's a Native woman that was up that night. She and her sister were on the porch smoking a cigarette outside, and she believed that she saw Sonya walking down the road. And so it's between 1 and 1:30 in the morning, so I'm sure there's not that many people out. So obviously when you see some young woman walking through, you're probably going to pay a little bit of attention, but even more so because they watched as a large, dark-colored SUV was slowly following behind her. And so they watched that happen for a little bit, and eventually that SUV pulled in front of Sonya, essentially blocking her path. And so Florence watched as Sonya walked up to this dark-colored SUV. She was at the window, and she started to speak to whoever was inside. And Florence was close enough to where this happened that she could even hear what Sonya was saying, and she heard something along the lines of, like, what's the problem or what's going on? And after a bit more conversation that she couldn't fully make out, Sonya opened the door to this SUV, hopped inside, and they drove off heading north, which is the opposite direction of where Sonya's apartment was, but it was the exact direction of the area where Sonya's body would later be found. Now, Florence, I guess, had this gut feeling that she had to remember this, had to look at the time, so she went inside and saw that this occurred at exactly 1:26 a.m. And probably one of the main reasons she decided to do this was because of the SUV. It was not just any dark-colored SUV. It was a dark-colored SUV that belonged to the Nome Police Department. And if this information was accurate, it meant that the last person seen with Sonya the night she disappeared was someone in uniform, someone that had sworn to protect her. But Florence, being a Native woman living in this Nome community for quite some time, also knew that it could be pretty dangerous for a Native woman to get into the car in the middle of the night with a police officer. And so she said that she grappled with this information for a day or two, and she was scared to call into the police. She wasn't sure what they'd do with this information. I feel like just your average person would already be scared to call information like that into police. Like, what if they ignore you because it's one of their own? I mean, there's so many things that can happen. What if they're angry and decide to come at you for trying to bring that information forward? I mean, it was a lot. And also, as someone who was already Alaskan Native, she didn't need any more issues with the people in charge of the town more than she did just being who she was. But ultimately, she decided within like a day or two of Sonya going missing and being found to call this information in. And unfortunately, her fear that someone would just ignore it is exactly what happened. Nobody had followed this lead up. I mean, it had literally been scribbled down and they moved on without a beat. No one had talked to Florence. No one had even looked into this. Nothing was done. And so upon hearing this information, Officer Ivanoff decided, I need to talk to someone about this. And so he immediately went to the sergeant and was like, we can no longer be in charge of this case anymore. There is a serious conflict of interest. Whoever killed Sonya Ivanoff could possibly be one of our own. So right away, ABI was called back out to take over the case. Now, ABI began digging deeper into all of this information. They were determined at this point to verify every single detail that Nome police had previously overlooked because, like I said, this tip had sat untouched for weeks. And now that it's possibly someone from within the department, nobody knows who. I mean, there's no telling what was overlooked or done improperly. I mean, it was a whole mess. And so they started looking into the logistics of the department and their patrol vehicles and who takes what vehicle and if they take them home. They needed to know all the information. And ABI ended up finding out that the department only had 3 expedition patrol vehicles. And they did something that's referred to as hot seat, where essentially all the officers share those same patrol vehicles during their shift. And so typically what would happen is the officer on duty would take one of those expeditions, and after their shift was over, they would go and pick up the next officer on shift, would swap out, they'd have the other officer take the patrol vehicle and drop them off at home. And I mean, it was just like a revolving door. And so none of the officers took any of the vehicles home. None of them, I think, even had like a specific patrol vehicle just for them. They all just rotated. It was like musical patrol SUVs. But what made it pretty damn easy was when they looked even further into it, there were only 2 patrol officers working the night that Sonya went missing. A man named Officer Stan Pascoya and a man named Officer Matthew Clay Owens. Now, Officer Pascoya had worked with the department for about 3 years, and his time there seemed to be pretty unremarkable. It doesn't seem anyone really had anything good or bad to say about him, but he did stand out because he had been the one to speak to Timory when she came and tried to report Sonya as missing. The one that had been so dismissive, the one who was like, she's probably with friends, the one who didn't want to initially take the report. And so obviously they're like, okay, well, now knowing what we do, it's kind of weird he didn't want to do anything about it. But Officer Owens was kind of in the exact same position. He also had been with the department for about 3 years, and he too had kind of like a sketchy, suspicious connection to the case. Because when Sonya's sister and brother-in-law came to put up her photo in the department, he had been the officer that was pissed about it. He was the one yelling at them to take it down and freaking out. And so both of them were questionable. So both of them were asked to fly into Anchorage to the ABI headquarters to formally be questioned and polygraphed. But before that could even happen, literally the day before, something even crazier went down. So it was late on the night of September 24th, 2003, when a call came in over the Nome Police Department radio that changed everything. An officer reported that one of the department's patrol cars, Unit 321, had been stolen from outside the station. And so officers were reaching out to everyone with the department, seeing if they had taken it, but ultimately no one claimed to have had the SUV. So obviously, because that meant someone random had a police vehicle, an intense search began right away. And so several officers went out to try to find this missing vehicle. And then finally at 2 a.m., a frantic call came in from none other than Officer Owens. one of those two officers that was working the night that Sonya went missing. Now, he claimed that he had found the expedition near a gravel pit on the outskirts of town. And I'm sure you're thinking, why does that sound familiar? Literally, it was the same one near the location where Sonya was found, like just down the road. And so they get this call, like, okay, at least we found it. But then 2 minutes later, Owens radioed dispatch again. And this time he was freaking out, okay? He is screaming, saying that he approached the vehicle, shots had been fired. I mean, he's literally saying he's in the middle of a shootout. It is utter chaos, and he asks for backup right away. Now, backup officers rush out to the scene, and when they arrive, they end up finding Owens, like, climbing out of the gravel pit as if he had been hiding, and the missing patrol unit sat there riddled with bullet holes. It had shattered windows. It looked like someone had maybe smashed one of the windows out with a rock. Owens appeared rattled, but he was unhurt, and almost immediately he started saying he got scared. He started saying that he was having this epiphany that maybe police work wasn't for him, like he was not cut out for this. He was thinking about his 4-year-old son. All of this was too dangerous. I mean, he literally had worked for several years with this police department. I don't know how long he had been in law enforcement just in general, but like all of a sudden, this one day before he's supposed to fly out to Anchorage to be polygraphed by the ABI, he all of a sudden is in the midst of a shootout. He finds this missing car and is like, oh, well, I guess I just don't want to be a cop anymore. Never mind. But that's not even the craziest part of the scene. What ended up being the craziest part of all of this is what was found inside of the patrol vehicle. Under all that broken glass, there was an envelope, and inside that envelope was a letter. And I'm not going to read the entirety of the letter. You can find it online, but a portion of it read, quote, "Pigs. I hate cops. I hate every one of you. Sonya was just a person in the wrong place at the wrong time. I don't know her. As you can see, it was easy for me to take your pig car keys right there. It was not her fault. She thought I was a pig and shit just happened. Every one of you should be more careful. I watch every move you make. You leave me alone and I'll leave you alone. I will also shoot you in the head if you get close." It's just this taunting tone, violent tone, claiming responsibility for Sonya's murder and basically threatening further attacks on police if they continued to try and find out who was behind it. And it seemed like they just wanted to show how easy it was to take the police car, and it almost seemed like they were claiming that's exactly what they did the first time, and that's who had actually picked up Sonya when she was murdered. But at this point, I don't even think it had been released publicly that it was a police car that was last seen with her. And so how would the person responsible have known that that information was out there and what was being actively looked into at that point in time? So you can see from the get-go, there were like these red flags going up that something about this still is just not making any sense. And this note had been placed right there on the front seat as if it were meant to be found immediately. And then the most chilling discovery, Sonya Ivanoff's missing identification card was also found in the envelope. So whoever had been in this car had to have been tied to the murder. But at this point, authorities were really questioning everything. You know, they believed it was one of their own at this point. They were even about to send 2 people down to Anchorage to be questioned in regard to the murder of Sonya. But this also was showing, if this letter was being truthful, that maybe it wasn't really that simple. Maybe they were being framed. ABI began digging deeper and found that the patrol cars for the department were not well secured at all. They were frequently left outside the building, sometimes unlocked, I think even most of the time unlocked, and with the keys inside. So really, at the right time, anyone could take one if they wanted to and just drive off with it. And because there were so few people at that department, maybe someone would notice right away. Maybe they wouldn't notice at all if it was in the middle of the night, like when Sonya was taken. And so despite them believing that it was someone from law enforcement behind this, maybe just like with Kunuk, despite things seeming to add up and point one way, it was all explainable and just a crazy coincidence. But those same red flags that I just spoke about just kept on bothering a lot of people looking into it. And as the investigators continued to process the scene of the shootout, the more troubling it became, because there were no shell casings, there were no footprints, and no evidence that anyone other than Owens had been there. So had this person decided to pull over here, get in a shootout with Owens, and afterward they somehow made no shoe impressions at all as they walked around to take the time to collect all of the casings And then they ran? I mean, super doubtful here, okay? Nome's not a big place, so when he called for backup, I can only imagine it arrived very quickly. So the idea that all that happened, first of all, just doesn't seem reasonable for someone to do in that situation, but also time-wise just doesn't seem right. And not just that, but the car's position off the road didn't align with the story of an active pursuit or shootout either. It's not like someone frantically pulled to the side when they realized that police were following them. This car was neatly parked. Owens also said that he saw the taillights of the car, and that's how he noticed it to begin with. But again, for someone to have the taillights on, that means their foot is on the brake. But then somehow, in less than a minute, that person goes from braking to parking, turning the car off, and then, according to Owens, ran to the trunk, pulled out a rifle, and then began shooting. Time-wise, it just doesn't seem very logical. So forensic techniques also showed nothing. They dusted for fingerprints. They ran DNA testing on the letter and the patrol car interior, but no usable prints or DNA were recovered from the note. It was really frustrating because this seemed to be lining up exactly with Sonya's murder, where nothing at all usable was left behind. So again, is it someone that just knows how to get rid of all of that really easily, or is it law enforcement? It was really bouncing back and forth. Inside the Nome Police Department, suspicion just continued to spread. The gunfire, the letter, that ID, nothing was making sense. No one knew who they could trust. So the day after that incident, Officer Piscoya did end up going to Anchorage to be interviewed and have his polygraph test with the ABI. But Owens, due to the trauma from the shootout, said that he could not go because he needed to stay behind and go to therapy. And so he ended up getting out of going down there to be questioned, at least on that day. So Piscoya was the first to be spoken to by ABI. Now, he ended up telling them that it was a busy shift the night that Sonya went missing. He said that he was out on calls a lot, and he said that one of his last calls, he and Owens actually went together to respond to a domestic violence complaint. And I guess when they got there, it turned ugly. There ended up being an altercation. I think that Owens got hit. And so basically, they ended up arresting this man and taking him to jail. And Piscoya claimed that he, after this, stayed behind at the department to fill out all of the paperwork. He was supposed to be off his shift soon. He had things he needed to tie up. And Owens went back out on patrol. Piscoya said he didn't go back out on patrol again. And all of this happened by like 12:30, maybe 1 at the latest. Meaning that during the time frame Sonya went missing, Owens was the only known police officer out and about in his patrol car. At this point, Piscoya said he was at the police department by himself, and he remained there until his shift ended at, I think, around 3. Now, when Owens ended up coming in about a week later for his round of questioning and polygraph, he corroborated most of the story that Piscoya said. He spoke about the domestic violence call and about how he went out on patrol afterwards. He said that he was out patrolling when bars were closing at around 1:30 to 2, and this is something he said he routinely did. He would just go up and down around that area to check for things like drunk driving and people that maybe needed some help or were getting into brawls now that the doors were closed. And so he claimed that's where he was that entire time. And then at around 3, he went back to the department to drive Piscoya home. And so now authorities are looking at this timeline that they've been given around the time Sonya went missing. And Piscoya is claiming he was at the department alone, and Owens is claiming he was out patrolling alone. And so they're like, okay, well, one of them is lying. Like, something's going on here. But both of them claim that there was no one else to verify their whereabouts at all. Like, they literally were just each on their own. So Piscoya went home at 3 a.m., but Owens was still on shift. I don't know if someone else came on shift to replace Piscoya or if at this point he was the only person on shift for the next few hours. But he said that after he dropped Piscoya off, he headed back to the police station to do paperwork. So this would be sometime after 3 a.m. And he said that the moment he walked in the door to the department, he ended up hearing a gunshot somewhere in the distance. And so it seemed almost like he was indicating he may have even heard the gunshot that killed Sonya. And so he claimed after hearing that, he immediately got back in his patrol vehicle and went out to look for where the shot came from. But after an hour of driving around aimlessly, he ultimately found nothing. And so he ended up being sent on one more call. He did some paperwork. And then at 7 a.m., he picked up the sergeant to swap cars and headed home himself. Now, when ABI cross-checked his statements with dispatch logs, his story really began to unravel. There were unexplained gaps in his patrol record, long stretches of time where his location could not be verified by radio contact or vehicle logs. Not just that, but they were getting feedback from investigators back in Nome that supported the questionability of Owens and his behavior. He had a history in the department, apparently, of not following the rules. Specifically, he seemed to love the night shift, likely because of certain things that he could get away with when everything was dark, the town was quiet, and there were few officers on shift. Apparently, Owens loved to bring along friends for unauthorized ride-alongs in those early morning and nighttime hours. And if it wasn't friends that he had with him, he was allegedly picking up women that were walking along Nome's streets, which is definitely something that's suspicious given the fact Sonya was picked up by a police officer, and Owens, one of the only two on shift that night, had a history of picking up women walking around Nome. And so authorities started to try to identify several of the women that he allegedly picked up just to kind of try to figure out what was going on. And I guess the ones that they did identify claimed everything was consensual, but they all described something that seemed eerily familiar. They said that Owens would slowly follow behind them for a bit and eventually would pull ahead of them, blocking their way. And so they'd have no choice but to really come up to the officer's window and talk to him. And I guess he would sweet talk them, and they all claimed he would invite them in his car and they would ultimately have sex. I don't know if it was known by the department that Owens was picking up women for sex on duty in the middle of the night, but it was known that he would bring these friends for unauthorized ride-alongs. And so I guess he was repeatedly told to stop doing that, but he never did because, again, he did not want to follow rules. So it wasn't out of the realm of possibilities that maybe while he was patrolling that night, he stumbled across Sonya. And they ended up finding out that Owens very likely knew Sonya and had actually searched her up in the department computers, which is very creepy behavior. She worked the night shift at the hospital. And so if anyone was brought in by officers that worked the night shift like Owens, she would be the first face that they would see. She would help admit everyone. So maybe that's how he figured out who she was to begin with and had some bizarre interest in her or something. And Owens did end up admitting that he knew who she was, but he was like, I don't personally know her. I've just seen her around. And he claimed that he had never picked her up before. He did also admit that he had searched for her in the database, but only to verify her age after seeing her at local bars, not because he saw her and had some weird, curious interest in her. And he also completely denied picking up any women at all while in his patrol car or even in his personal vehicle. He said that was absolutely ridiculous. He had never done it, despite speaking to all these women who claimed that he absolutely had. But the odd behavior that they uncovered just deepened. Investigators also decided to speak to his soon-to-be ex-wife. Apparently, during all of this, he was going through a rough divorce. There was a nasty custody battle that was going on, and he had been kicked out of the house and was renting a room from a family friend. And so his soon-to-be ex-wife ended up telling authorities bombshell information. She claimed that on August 12th, and she remembered that very vividly because it's Owen's birthday, he ended up giving her a frantic call. She was at work about to get off, so it was around 4:30 p.m., and he claimed that he needed to drop their son off early because he had been called into work early. And he specifically told her that there was a missing girl and it, quote, wasn't looking good. And so I'm sure you're wondering, why did this alarm investigators? This call, like I said, according to his wife, happened at 4:30. Sonya was not reported missing that day until after 5. And so why would he say that? How would he know that information if no one had reported her as missing yet? Now, I personally have my own questions about that because how could he have known someone was about to report her as missing? Like, why would he draw attention to there being a missing girl and it wasn't looking good if he didn't even know if she would ever be reported missing, let alone like 30 minutes to an hour after he had this conversation? Just questions that I've had in my head. But regardless, just like Piscoya, Owens also took a polygraph test. Biscoya passed it. Owens did not. Now, investigators began to focus on Owens more closely. Forensics team searched his home and vehicles, looking for any trace of evidence that could connect him to Sonya's murder. And a tip ended up coming in that led them to a hunting camp about 70 miles away, where someone claimed to have seen Officer Owens burning what looked like a brand new pair of gloves in the fire pit. And they were like, that's weird. Why would he buy like this really nice, expensive looking brand new pair of gloves? And then hearing all the information that was coming out, they're like, you know what? There might be something sketchy about this. And so authorities decided to go out to the camp and they began sifting through the burn pile. And it didn't take them long to find something. It was an eyelet for shoelaces, specifically for Skechers, the same kind of shoes that Sonya had been wearing the night that she went missing. And so right away, the entire burn pit was moved to Nome, where they continued sifting from there. Now, they ended up finding several more eyelets from the Skechers shoes. They also found metal clasps to a bra, and they found a metal pant button with the brand Tilt on it. And when they went to speak to Sonya's family to ask about some of the brands of jeans she wore, one of the main brands that she wore was Tilt. So it started to become clear that all these missing clothes and shoes from Sonya likely had been burned in this pit. But all of this was still very circumstantial because they couldn't prove that for a fact. And even though Owens went to hunt at this hunting camp, they also couldn't directly tie it to him. And then they ended up finding a key. And this burned key was to a post office box belonging to Owens' uncle. And so at this point, they're like, okay, we're getting closer. We've got to see if we can find this casing. So they went back out to the area where Sonya was found, and they meticulously searched through all the brush, all the dirt, and they ended up finding a .22 casing, matching the caliber of gun that had shot Sonya. However, this still didn't directly connect to Officer Owens. His issued weapon was not a .22. And I'm unsure if they knew of all of his firearms that he had at home, not only being someone in law enforcement, but also living in Alaska. I guarantee you his issued weapon was not the only gun that he had. And most people, if they go hunting, are going to have a rifle. And so to me, it seems like that would kind of be like the first step of where they would check next, because even if it didn't match his issued weapon, who's to say he didn't bring personal weapons, especially if he was doing all these extracurricular activities while he was on duty. But instead, Officer Redburn, who had been that day shift officer assigned to Sonya's case, made a suggestion. And he was like, you know what? I think you should look at the evidence room at the police department. Maybe someone took a gun from there, specifically Owens, and he used that in the crime. Investigators found that the key to that evidence room in the Nome Police Department was about as secure as their patrol cars. The key to that evidence room was in the sergeant's open mailbox for anyone to grab, okay? And so they're like, all right, well, that means that literally anyone in the department could have access to it. And so there was no way to know for sure who went in and out of this evidence locker like you would typically have in larger departments. And so they're like, you know what, we're just going to start going through all of the guns. And they eventually found a Jennings .22. And they had sent the casing in for testing and had been given a list of guns back that particular casing could have come from. And a Jennings .22 was one of those weapons on the list. And so they're like, you know what, this might be it. We're going to send it off for testing. And when investigators spoke to a woman that he was seeing during this time, she ended up telling them that Owens had been speaking to her about getting out of Alaska. He's like, hey, you want to just like get out of here with me? Let's move completely out of this state. It seemed like he was going to run, and they were not about to let him do that. So on October 25th, 2003, despite a mostly circumstantial case, Matthew Owens was arrested for the murder of Sonya Ivanoff. The news spread across Nome almost instantly. For many, it felt impossible to believe that one of their own officers could have been responsible, but for others, especially the Alaska Native women who had long felt dismissed by local law enforcement, this arrest was not shocking at all. All it was confirmation of what they had dealt with and feared and endured for years at this point. And after his arrest, even more evidence of the poor treatment of Native women piled up. When authorities went and found some of the women that he had allegedly invited into his car previous to his arrest, All of them had claimed things were consensual. But now that he was arrested, ones claiming that it wasn't consensual finally felt safe to come forward. Some of these women claimed that they had been arrested for something, and before he took them in to be processed, he assaulted them. Some of the women also said that they had just been simply walking in Nome, and they were lured in by Owens, offering a safe ride home only to be assaulted. And he told several of them that threatened to tell on him that nobody would believe a drunk Alaskan Native woman. And unfortunately, he was right, because several of them did try to go and report all of what happened to them and that Owens was a monster, and they were completely ignored and dismissed. And had someone actually done something about this and believed these women, or at least looked into it, it could have prevented Sonya's murder. And at the very least, it could have connected Owens to her murder a lot faster. Now, when the case finally went to trial, Nome was obviously still reeling. It was a really tough situation when you have such a tight-knit community to find out something like that. Someone that was supposed to protect you, the feeling that maybe that police department was instead protecting one of their own instead of the people they were literally hired to protect. That's a lot to grapple with. But everyone was happy that this trial was finally starting and going to be over, hopefully ending in justice and answers. Now, the prosecution brought forward over 70 witnesses, and they presented a pretty meticulous timeline showing Owens' patrol route between August 10th and 11th in 2003, aligning with the window of Sonya's disappearance. They called forward witnesses, including Florence, who had seen Sonya get into the police SUV. They also outlined the similarities between Owens' assigned vehicle and the vehicle described. There was no confusing them. The fact that the decal for Nome Department was there, the fact that she reported this within just a few days, and the fact that it had been ignored. They also introduced his history of bringing women into his car. The forensic evidence was also introduced, but unfortunately, it just wasn't really strong. They had the casing, they had the burned items, they had the letter in the patrol car. There were all these things so loosely connecting Owens to the crime, but still a lot of it was circumstantial. And they could never formally prove that gun that was found in the police department evidence locker was actually the one that was used. Prosecutors argued that Owens had staged that patrol car theft just a day before he was supposed to be interviewed to divert suspicion. He was trying to create this boogeyman, this ghost killer that authorities would spend years chasing. It's just like the bushy-haired man that a lot of suspects use to throw off an investigation. You know, let's go find this bushy-haired man that was actually behind these attacks, when really it was just this created person to have authorities searching for someone that doesn't exist. Same concept, just with a cop-hating maniac that was apparently on the loose. And this was meant to be his shield, a way to hide behind the authority of his badge and the chaos that he himself had created. And it did work, like momentarily, but thankfully a lot of people saw right through it. Prosecutors also highlighted how the killer showed what they called evidence awareness, the kind of precision that comes from someone trained in law enforcement, like not your average person would know all of the things to successfully get that much evidence to disappear. They also reminded jurors that Sonya's clothing and belongings had been removed, that shell casings were missing, the placement of her body, all of it suggested an intentional effort to eliminate forensic traces. And so many of those things were found at a hunting camp that Owens was known for going to. In their closing arguments, they told the jury that this was not a random attack, but it was the calculated act of someone who knew exactly how to cover their tracks. This was, as one prosecutor described it, quote, a crime committed by someone who knew every step police would take before they took it. Now, the defense countered back pretty strong. They went right against the prosecution's narrative by arguing that the investigation had been fueled more by public outrage than conclusive proof. They pointed out that there was no definitive DNA profile or fingerprint evidence or anything that tied Owens directly to the murder scene, which technically is true. They also emphasized that multiple officers and staff had access to Nome Police Department vehicles and equipment, meaning that someone else could have easily used or tampered with the patrol SUV that the witness reported seeing. The defense also pointed out that the gun used couldn't even be conclusively determined to be tied to Owens. They all even brought forward a witness that claimed they had seen someone that looked like Sonya racing past them in a blue truck on Monday, which was after she was thought to have been missing. And this would indicate she was alive and well after Owens had that shift that night, that maybe all of this timeline was off. But even this witness, while he said that he saw someone he believed looked like Sonya rush past him that Monday, he couldn't say with 100% certainty that it was her. Owens himself also took the stand and claimed that he had nothing to do with Sonya's murder. He said that he could explain away most of the evidence, and mainly he seemed to be claiming that his wife was wrong. He said that she had her dates mixed up and that he never spoke to her on the 12th, that he actually spoke to her about a week later about a missing girl. However, that doesn't make sense either, because at that point, Sonya had already been found. She was no longer a missing girl. So why, a week after she was discovered, would he call his wife and say that there was a missing girl and it wasn't looking good? Like, it was already all over the news. It was a known thing at this point. She was no longer missing. So I just don't trust a word of what he said there. Owen's uncle also was called up to testify because the key was found in that fire pit. But his uncle said that he never gave Owens a key to his mailbox, so he had no idea how that key ended up at the hunting camp that Owens frequented. And I mean, it's easy to put two and two together, but again, there was no absolute connection there. Now, the defense also questioned the credibility of witnesses the prosecution brought and highlighted inconsistencies in the investigation itself, suggesting that law enforcement had really latched on to Owens because he fit the narrative that the public was demanding. And they even raised concerns about venue bias, arguing that in such a small community, nearly everyone knew Sonya or someone connected to the department, making a fair trial almost impossible. And in the end, they really just portrayed Owens as a scapegoat. He was the easiest person to blame when the town wanted someone to pay. And again, I have such a problem with that, because if you look historically at situations like this where police departments need some sort of scapegoat, they're probably not going to go after a law enforcement officer. They're more likely going to go after some random person who's homeless or struggles with drug addiction or, is an Alaskan native that they can pin this all on, that has no money for a good lawyer, no way to defend themselves, probably doesn't even remember what they were doing a week ago. Like, that's the kind of person they're typically going to try to pin it on, not a police officer. So that was a very interesting, choice to make. And not only that, but they also pointed out someone else that they believe should have been looked into further. Officer Redburn. Redburn, according to Owens' defense, had it out for Owens. Owens apparently reported Officer Redburn for hitting a suspect, I guess during one of their arrests or something along those lines. And so Redburn got in trouble. But not just that, Redburn had also been the officer that was working that day shift investigating the case. There were the two officers that were assigned to her case when all the other officers were called off, and Redburn was the one that was supposed to be mainly working it. He was the one not sharing information with the night shift or pretty much anyone else, which made it likely that he also was the one that got that tip from Florence Haybros and chose, for whatever reason, to ignore it. He also was the one to suggest authorities check in the evidence locker to see if there was a .22 in there that could have been used. And finally, Owens was also having an affair with Redburn's daughter. And so there are just all of these little things that I can see why they pointed him out as someone that probably wasn't looked into. I mean, why did he ignore that information from Florence? I also thought it was so strange that when the most logical route would be to go and see if Owens had any .22s, that Redburn immediately stepped up and was like, no, check the evidence locker. Like, why would he do that? I just have lots of questions at the end of this that I'm not feeling very comfortable about. So really, if you look at this case, I wasn't sure what the outcome was going to be because, even with most cases where a lot of circumstantial evidence is what they're relying on, you have a hard time seeing a jury come to any sort of conclusion. And then when you have the defense bring forward a lot of questions that I feel like most people with common sense would have and they've not been answered, I can see how there would be problems. And so sure enough, like I kind of assumed was going to happen, by the end of this trial, the jury came back deadlocked. It was a mistrial. So he would have to have a whole other trial. They would have to do this all over again. And I hate seeing that because of the victims' families. It is hard enough for all these families to sit through these trials to begin with. Sitting through it twice, And it doesn't end there. I talk about this all the time. You've got the trial for these families of these victims, which these families are victims as well. They have to sit through these trials. They might have to sit through a second trial. And then after that, they have to sit through appeals processes and all of these things and keep fighting for justice. Like, it feels so fragile the entire time. It's never something that these families are able to just put down and say, it's done. I don't have to worry about this anymore. I can heal and move on. And so it makes me so angry that her family had to sit through a second trial. Now, Owen's attorney ended up fighting for a change of venue, again, citing fairness of the trial, which was already brought up in the first trial, and it was agreed upon, which I don't think is a bad thing. I definitely think they never should have had it in Nome. I'm kind of surprised they even had the first one there. But when this new trial began, less than a year later, it was, I can't remember what the town was called, but it was a flight away from Nome. So it wasn't like a super easy town over situation. So it was fresh eyes, a whole new community, a whole new jury panel. But both the prosecution and the defense seemed to bring forward the exact same points. No one really changed anything. And so it was really interesting to kind of see, what's going to end up happening with that. Are people going to come to the same conclusion, or are they going to find something different? But interestingly, in the middle of this trial, there was a huge breakthrough, at least what the prosecution thought would be a huge breakthrough. Now, that officer that worked night shift, Officer Ivanoff, who was one of the two officers that was assigned to Sonya's case, said that he was speaking to one of his neighbors during the second trial about the case, because he'd worked on it. And the neighbor was like, oh, well, have you ever hear anything about XYZ? And it was just this damning piece of information. And Officer Ivanoff is like, wait a minute, what? So apparently, this neighbor had spoken with the woman that was the family friend Owens was staying with at the time of the murder. So technically his landlord, but she had been known by the family for a very long time. And she had apparently confided into this neighbor that she saw Sonya's ID and wallet in Owens' room, and it freaked her out. None of that information had ever made its way to investigators. This woman that was a family friend of Owens never brought it forward. The neighbor never brought it forward. It was never introduced at the first trial, but that would be a pretty huge connection because whoever killed Sonya was the one who had her ID. They were also the one behind the theft of the patrol vehicle. And so that would be a huge connecting piece, which would be huge for this case because so far they hadn't really had anything. And so at this point, they're like, you know what? Being a family friend, they were worried she might lie for him. So authorities decided they were going to get a warrant and have this neighbor call her, and they were going to record the phone call. And so the neighbor called and started talking to her and brought up the fact that she saw the ID and wallet belonging to Sonya in Owen's room. And she didn't deny seeing it, but she also didn't say for sure that she did. Instead, she kind of seemed to beat around the bush by saying, oh, well, I don't remember that, but I think I missaw or misspoke because the news said it was found. She just said, oh, well, the news said it was found. So basically there's no way she could have seen that. But it was not a solid yes or no answer. And so once they had that, they decided to call her to the stand. And so she was on stand. She was asked about this, and she ended up fully denying everything. She straight up said no. She had never seen any of those items in Owen's room, and she had never told anyone that she saw those items. But they were also able to play this recording where she spoke to the person that she told that, and she didn't deny it then. So it was interesting that things had changed from then to now when she was testifying. And I think that really kind of said a lot to the jury. Now, the prosecution at this point ended up arguing that Owens essentially did what he had already with so many other women. Maybe he had seen Sonya in the bars when he patrolled at night and he set his sights on her, looked her up in the system to figure out where she lived. Maybe he wanted to try to patrol those areas in case she was on a walk. And they believe that he ended up stumbling across her and saw an opportunity. So he stopped and offered her a ride. And being a familiar face and someone that she probably thought she could trust, she agreed. But Owens likely made sexual advances like he had with so many other women who got into his patrol vehicle, and that turned the situation very dangerous. Everyone that knew Sonya said she was outspoken, she was fiery, and she likely said hell no. And she probably freaked out, threatened to turn him in. She played no games. And more than likely, she felt like a potential threat to Owens. She was strong, almost 6 feet tall, young and brave, and likely dismissed him. So instead of mocking her like he had so many others and risking someone believing her if she turned him in, maybe he felt irritated and angry and decided to just silence her permanently. Now, another one of my questions that is just something in the back of my mind that I kept thinking about is I'm not sure if they believe he just kept that evidence gun from the evidence room with him when he planned to pick up women in case it went bad. Like maybe he every shift went in and grabbed it and took it out with him, or maybe this was somehow premeditated. I guess they didn't really focus much on that because they never confirmed that was the gun used. But either way, they believe that's what happened, and he killed Sonya and did his damnedest to try to cover it up. After weeks of testimony in the second trial, the jury finally reached a verdict, and I was like on the edge of my seat, like, what's going to happen? Is this going to be another mistrial? Because even that huge piece of evidence that was hearsay, could have connected him to the ID, but that just didn't work out. Like, is this just going to be another hung jury? But ultimately, that's not what happened. This jury found Owens guilty of first-degree murder and evidence tampering. And ultimately, he was sentenced to 101 years in prison. Owens, even after that, continued to maintain his innocence. He hasn't really spoken publicly himself or even much through his lawyers, but I do believe his brother has said something for him directly after his conviction, basically saying he's innocent, that he was framed, the whole nine that Owens had been saying the entire time. So nothing different really than what Owens and his attorneys had been saying, but he has since made several appeals. His initial appeal was denied in 2010, and his petition for post-conviction relief was rejected again in 2021, and I cannot find any other current appeals in motion at this point. So as far as I know, he remains incarcerated in Alaska, and maybe he's considering appealing again, but I think he knows it's not going to go his way. Now, Sonya's murder didn't just lead to a conviction, it ended up changing the law. In 2007, Alaska enacted the Sonya Ivanoff Act, which established a mandatory 99-year minimum sentence for any peace officer convicted of first-degree murder committed while on duty. Honestly, it should be on duty and off duty, but whatever. And the law was a direct response to her case, a statement that authority does not place anyone above accountability. Lawmakers, advocates, and Sonya's family pushed for this legislation together. They wanted to make sure that what happened in Nome couldn't happen again anywhere else in at least Alaska, that no department could just ignore these red flags or delay justice the way that Nome police had in those early days. The witness statement describing Sonya entering a marked police SUV had sat untouched for weeks. That was so unbelievable. And some officers had apparently resisted outside help, unwilling to consider that one of their own could be involved. It doesn't seem like anyone outright knew who exactly was involved, but there are several things that had occurred during the time of the investigation before Owens was arrested where it seemed like no one wanted anyone else to find out. Like they were willing to protect their own. Whether that was through denial or possibly misplaced loyalty, either way, their hesitation cost valuable time. And for many in the community, especially Alaskan Native women, that is a pretty damn big deal. The Sonya Ivanoff Act stands today as both a safeguard and a promise that authority without accountability has absolutely no place in justice, and that trust, once broken, can only be rebuilt through transparency and action. Now, the Nome Police Department also ended up moving to a new building, and they claim to have a whole new department from the ground up so that things like this can't happen again. Pretty much all with the explicit aim of preventing the recurrence of past issues and hopefully ensuring a fresh start. And I can only hope that they've stuck with that because during an internal investigation, the small town of Nome, with only a few thousand residents, was found to have over 400 open sexual assault cases. So clearly, so much was being dismissed in this little town, so much was being brushed under the rug, and that's likely exactly what led to Owens feeling bold enough and safe enough within those walls to do exactly what he did, and then to escalate it to murder. When you look back on Sonya's story, I feel like it's impossible not to think about everything that she had ahead of her, or at least should have had ahead of her. She should have gone to college. She should have come home to visit her family and tell them about her plans. She should have been able to walk barefoot on Hawaiian beaches, soaking up the warmth that she had been dreaming about and pushing toward. She should have grown older, surrounded by friends who loved her. And instead, all of that was stolen overnight. Her family lost a daughter, a sister, a friend. Nome lost a bright young woman who wanted nothing more than to just build a simple life for herself. Sonya's story, thankfully, doesn't end with her murder. Her legacy isn't just in tragedy, but it's in the change that followed, and that is my favorite kind of case to cover, because these stories are tragic, they are awful, but they're also a reality that likely is never, ever going to go away. And so the only way I feel like these families and communities can take control back is by turning these tragedies into something that will help others, because that's something that these criminals are never going to be able to touch. So on that note, you guys, I'm going to go ahead and go. I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Sonya's story. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallan fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.